When it comes to building our app, we want to use the best code editor out there. And I think that the best code editor for React development is Visual Studio Code. You can grab it for free at code.visualstudio.com. You can download the appropriate version for your computer. You can also grab an insider's version, which includes some newer features that haven't been released for the stable build just yet. That's what I'm going to be using. But the more important question here is, how do we set up VS Code for React development for best building our app? So let's open it up, assuming you've already downloaded it and installed it on your computer. The first thing that I'd recommend you do is go to, up at the top, Code Insiders, go to Preferences, and then Settings. We want to make it easy to write JSX. The easiest way to do that using VS Code is with a tool called Emmet. So we're going to search for Emmet in Settings, and we want to go to Emmet Include Languages, and we want to add an item here. It's kind of like a key value pair. We want to add an item with the key name of JavaScript and the value of JavaScript React. And that's going to make it possible in any one of our files to be able to write a bit of JSX and then have it auto-completed for us. So it's very helpful. The second tool that I'd recommend you have is an extension that doesn't come baked into VS Code, but you can install it by going to View Extensions. And this extension is called Prettier. So you want to type Prettier in your extension search. It should be the first result that comes up, and you'll want to install it. This, as you can see in the title, is a code formatter. It's going to automatically format all of our React code, all of our JavaScript files whenever we save. And the way that we can get that set up is by going to, still within our settings area, go to a setting called Format on Save. So we can type that in and just make sure that that is checked. So whenever we save a file, so whenever we type something, some valid JavaScript, and hit save, it's going to be automatically formatted for us by Prettier. We're also going to be using something called automatic imports. And the benefit of that is we can just type the name of a component or a function and hit tab, and it's going to be automatically imported for us. What I'd recommend is that you have, if you type in auto imports in the settings search, I'd recommend that you have, for this setting, JavaScript Preferences Import Module Specifier, the preferred path style for auto imports to be relative. So that means that whenever you create an automatic import, it's going to be, it's going to import a certain component, not from an absolute path, which is fine to use. And it looks like something like this. Say we're getting a component from /components/component. This would be an absolute import. What I'd recommend, although it is your choice, I'd recommend you set this to relative, so that when we have an auto import created for us, all we have to do is write the name of the component, and it's going to create a relative path instead of an absolute one. This is just a preference that I'd recommend you include, but it's ultimately up to you. And then finally, the last extension that you're going to need to have for building this app, or at least I'd recommend, it's not required, but it's helpful. If you go to View Extensions, I like a tool called Bracket Pair Colorizer, and it helps with, this isn't the one, let me go back to extensions. There's a couple of different versions, 1 and 2. It's very helpful for being able to see brackets, say whenever you write a given function, to see where the function begins and ends, as well as things like if statements, etc. So this is just an extension that you can install. It's automatically set up, and it makes your code a lot easier to read. So with that, we're fully set up for React development, for building our app, and we're ready to move on to seeing how to start building our app. To build our WhatsApp clone, we're going to need to have a few tools installed on our computer. The first thing that we're going to need to have is Node.js. You can grab the long-term support version here if you don't have it, or if you'd like to upgrade your version of Node. Node comes with npm, which is going to be our package manager to install all of our dependencies for our project. The code editor that I'm going to be using, and I'd recommend you use, is Visual Studio Code. You can download the version that's appropriate for your computer at code.visualstudio.com. And finally, for our database and all of our asset storage, like for our media files and audio files, we're going to be using Firebase. So for Firebase, which you can visit by going to just firebase.com or firebase.google.com, you will need to have a Google account. Otherwise, it's entirely free to use. We're going to be using the free tier of Firebase, and that's going to be sufficient for building our application from front to back. To begin creating our project, we need to grab the starting code, which really just includes the shell of our project as well as all of the dependencies that we need. We're going to be making this project completely from scratch. I've just added a little bit of boilerplate that would be a little bit tedious for you to make on your own, like components and a few custom styles. Click on the link in the description of this video, and you're going to have a zip file installed on your computer called Whatsap clone. This is going to include all the starting files for our project, and we just want to unzip that and then drag this into our code editor. So you're going to want to make sure that you have your code editor open. And once it is, you can just literally take the folder and drag it into our code editor, or you can go to File, Open, and select the folder manually. So here we can see all of our files consists of a package.json file. If we look at the dependencies, we're going to be using Material UI for the styles as well as icons. Compressor.js is going to be useful for compressing our media files. Firebase, again, to interact with the Firebase backend that we're going to be using for our project. React and React DOM. We're going to be using some custom hooks from the React Firebase hooks library. We're going to use React Router DOM as our routing library and React scripts. So we're using Create React App. We're going to be able to start our project with the command npm start. And if we head over to our source folder, you'll see that we just have a couple of folders here for our components and all of our dedicated hooks that we're going to be creating all of our custom hooks. But it's very simple. It's identical to any Create React app that you've made in the past. It consists of an index.js file, which just renders our app component, which is also right here within source, which we're going to fill out, as well as all of our other components here. You can see next to them they have an associated CSS file. So the CSS file is just going to be imported into the JS file of the same name. As you can see here with this audioplayer.js file, it's importing audioplayer.css. That's also within this components folder. And that's basically it for our starting app structure. We're going to be filling out everything that you see here, and we just need to install all of our dependencies. So we can open our terminal, and we can do that by going to either View and selecting Terminal, or you can use the shortcut, which I use, of Control or Command and then the tilde key. Should be right underneath the escape key. And we're going to be installing all of our dependencies with the command npm I. This should take a minute or two. Don't worry if there are any severity vulnerabilities found. If you'd like to fix them, you can run npm audit fix. You're not going to see these if you use the package manager yarn. Feel free to use that. You can just run yarn if you want to use this as an alternative to npm. But once this is entirely done, we should see our Node modules folder. It looks like VS Code may not have updated, but we can see it here within Finder, so that was added. And to be able to start our project and see where we're starting from, we can just run npm start, and that should run our project using React scripts and start up the development server on localhost 3000. Once again, this might take a minute or two to finish for our project to be compiled for development, but once it's done, you see the app running on localhost 3000. You should just see the text app, and that is coming from our app component that's being rendered within index.js. Before we dig into building out the structure of our project, creating all of our components and hooks, let's set up Firebase. Firebase is going to be the backend for our project. It's an ideal choice since we're making a project, we're making a messenger app that relies on live or real-time data. Whenever we chat with somebody, we want chat messages to be sent instantly to other users. So it's good to use a technology to, in this case, use a database to store not only all of those messages, but also to be able to send them in real time. Firebase is perfect for that. So Firebase is not only going to take care of all of the real-time functionality for us. Note that Firebase is a NoSQL database. It's kind of an unstructured database, not like that of a SQL database like Postgres, which includes columns and tables. We'll dive into the exact structure that Firebase, specifically a Firestore database, is going to provide for us. But Firebase is also going to include a lot of asset management for us as well. We're going to be able to upload image as well as audio files in our project. We're going to see how to upload them as well as how to play them. And we're going to be able to send those to other users in the chat rooms that we're going to be setting up, or in the individual chats that we're going to have with our users. So we want Firebase to be able to manage all of this, all of the different asset types that we're going to have in real time. So what we're going to do right now is we're just going to set up Firebase, and we're going to do that by heading to firebase.google.com. Note that you want to be logged in with your Google account, and once you are, you can just hit Go to Console. So once we're taken to our console, we can see any existing Firebase projects that we might have if we've already created one. We want to select Add Project to create the one that we're making for this project. So let's give it the name, maybe Whatsap clone. And we're going to be given a unique identifier, a unique slug. We'll hit Continue. We can set up Google Analytics for our project if we like. Then we'll hit Create Project. Once that's done, once we see that our project's ready, we'll just hit Continue. And we'll be taken to an overview of it. So we want to add Firebase to our application. To do that, we want to hit the Web button. You can see this little code button that we have here. We'll click on that. We can give our app a nickname. We can just give it the same name, Whatsap clone. We don't want to set up Firebase hosting. We're not going to be using Firebase hosting for our project. We certainly could, but we're actually going to be using Netlify for our app when we get to the step of deploying it to the web. So we'll provide our nickname and hit Register App. And once that's done, we'll be prompted to add the Firebase SDK. This is all of the code that we're going to need in order to configure Firebase with React so we can start making requests to our Firestore database and really all of the assets that Firebase gives us. So what we want to do here, we see that there are a couple of script tags. We don't need that. We're not importing this into a vanilla JavaScript project. What we're going to do is we're just going to copy everything within the script tag, the config, and also where we're initializing the config with the help of Firebase. We're going to import it using ES modules. So we're going to head back to our project, and we're going to go to the firebase.js file, a file that I didn't cover before. But we're going to paste in all of this code. And what we're going to need to import up at the top is Firebase, which we installed and we can see is listed in our dependencies. So we're going to import Firebase from Firebase. And in fact, we can be a little bit more precise. We can import Firebase from Firebase/app. That's really what we're referencing when we're using Firebase, when we're going to be using it to initialize our Firebase app, as well as to set up all these different Firebase tools, these Firebase services. So that's what we're going to be bringing in as well. We're going to import Firebase/auth. Note that this isn't going to be a named import. We're just importing the dependency. we're also going to import Firebase/Firestore. So these are specific services that we're using. We're going to be using the auth service so that we can authenticate our users with the help of Firebase. So that's what Firebase also consists of, in addition to being able to upload media files and having a really nice NoSQL real-time database. It gives us really convenient authentication strategies, as well as a Google authentication strategy, which we're going to be using for third-party authentication. For storing our different files, we're going to import Firebase/storage. And finally, Firebase/database, which is kind of the older real-time database that Firebase offered. Firestore is a kind of newer version of it. So once we've initialized our configuration here in this configuration object, we're going to set up a number of different variables. We're going to create a bunch of different variables so that we can actually directly work with each part of Firebase, each one of these services individually. So once we initialize our app, it's going to return a reference to our Firebase app instance. So let's put this in a variable called Firebase app. So some things that we're going to use and we're going to put in these variables are going to be from Firebase, and some are going to be connected to Firebase app. So the first thing to reference our database, so we'll put this in a variable called db, is Firestore. And that's going to be Firebase app.firestore. And we want to execute this like a method. We're going to see how we can use what's stored in db, the reference to Firestore, to be able to interact with our database, to be able to query or fetch data, and also to make changes to that data, what's stored in the database, through the different collections and documents that we're going to have. That's how our database is structured, with collections and documents. Again, we'll cover this a bit later. For the auth module, that's going to come from Firebase app.auth. Again, we're going to execute this as a function, and we're going to put this in a variable called auth. The next one is going to be provider. This is going to be our Google Auth provider. And for this, instead of Firebase app, we're going to reference Firebase by saying new firebase.auth.Google Auth provider. For storage, we're going to say firebase.storage, and we're going to execute this like a method. And we're going to have a reference using this ref method to reference all of the images, and we can denote that with this string that we pass to it. It's going to be stored within our storage bucket and under a folder called images. At any time that we want to upload an image, we're going to be using this storage reference. And then for audio storage, we'll put that in a variable called audio storage. We're going to use the reference firebase.storage.ref with the text or the folder audios. And then two more variables that we're going to create are create timestamp. That's going to be from firebase.firestore.field value, and that's written in Pascal case, so make sure to capitalize both field and value, dot server timestamp. So we're going to be using timestamps, and we're going to be creating timestamps using this function because it's going to tell Firestore to create a timestamp to create a given time when something was created, and that's going to allow us to organize our documents or perform a query that allows us to sort them in a certain way based off of the timestamp when a certain document was created. And then we're also going to have another reference to a server timestamp from firebase.database.server value.timestamp in all caps. So now, using all these references, we're going to export an object that contains each of these as properties. And this is going to, with this exported object, we're going to pass it to our app and just be able to import all of our different variables here to be able to use each one of the services that we've set up. So we'll include DB auth provider, storage, audio storage, create timestamp, and server timestamp. And that's it. We can just hit save, and we've got Firebase set up. And now we're ready to start working with it so that we can make our application functional as we build out all of our components. The next step we're going to take is setting up authentication for our app. And what's really cool is that you get to see how easy it is to do this with Firebase and really get a sense of how great using Firebase is in terms of development. So once we're back on our main project overview, we can just hit authentication. We're going to hit get started. And as I mentioned, we're going to be using third-party authentication, namely Google authentication. So we're going to head to the Sign In Method tab, and we want to select Enable. Once we've selected Google as our provider, we can give our project a public-facing name. So of course we can call this our WhatsApp clone or whatever name that you'd like to provide. We also need to provide a project support email for this to work. So we'll provide that, probably the one associated with your account, and then we'll hit save. Once Google's been enabled, we're going to set it up within our application, and we really want this login component that we're going to be setting up to be what our user sees first when they visit our app. We want them to log in to be able to chat with other users. We need to know who they are. So we're going to be using the login component within the components folder. But as you can see, we're displaying the app component. Well, we're going to be displaying login within app if we don't have a user. We're going to see how to set that up in just a second to check to see if there's a user. We'll see that in the next video. But for right now, we just want to return the login component. So we can import that. You can use auto import if that's available to you, or you can just import it manually. You can import login from ./components/login. So when we save, we should see login instead of app, and we can hit Command or Control, click on login to jump to that component. And first, let's build the appearance of our component. We want to return a div with the class name of app. Within it will be a div with the class name of login, and then another child div with the class login __. We're using the BEM convention for naming these classes that we're getting from our CSS files. So login __ container. I won't say __ every time, but it's the login container class. We're going to be using within that an image element, and we're going to be referencing an image within our public folder. This is going to be the login logo image, which is a PNG file. So we can reference anything within our public folder just by saying // if it was within another folder. If it was nested within a folder called image, it would be /image/ then the name of that image file. And the name of this is login logo.png, and we can just give it an alt text of logo. And then as a sibling element, we'll include a div with the class of login text, which will have an h1 that says sign in to WhatsApp. And after this div, which contains our h1, we will include a button, but it's not going to be a standard button. It's going to be a styled one from Material UI. So we're going to import the button from Material, which begins with an @ symbol, @Material UI/core. And we're going to have a button here with the text sign in with Google. And we're going to have an onClick, which is going to call a new function, which we'll call login. And we'll put it within this component. So we'll make a function, the name of login, just a standard JavaScript function. And what are we going to do to be able to log in our user? Well, we just need to import two things. Again, we're exporting an object from our Firebase file. So we will import both auth, the auth service, as well as provider, which is connected to the Google provider option from .. so one level up Firebase. So within login, look at how easy this is. We can just say auth dot sign in with redirect. After we call this and a user successfully signs in, we want to navigate them away from the login component. And note that we can only use sign in with redirect with a provider, with a third-party auth provider like Google or Facebook or any one of the many other third-party auth options that Firebase provides. But it's going to take us to Google to be able to sign in, and then it's going to take us back to our app. And that's what it means by the redirect. And that's it. We can just hit save, and we might need to refresh. So now we can see the login component here. We can hit sign in with Google, and it's going to take us to accounts.google.com, where we're going to be able to select a particular Google account that we have. And then we'll be taken back to our application. So we don't have an indication of it just yet, but the login here was successful. And then the next step in the next video, we're going to see how to get the user that's currently authenticated within our app. Before we take a look at how we can bring in the user state from our currently logged in user into our application, I just want to note that if we head to our Firebase console and we go to our authentication tab or return to it, and we hit the users tab, we can see the new user as well as their email address, when they were created, when they signed in, as well as their user ID. So we're going to be able to access all of these fields, all of these data points, whenever we fetch our user. That's one. The second thing is, right now we don't have a sign out method, a way to sign out our user. Whenever you hit sign in with Google, again, what's going to happen is the account that you signed in with is going to be remembered by Google. And if you're using the Chrome browser, you can see this right here, that Google has you signed in with that account in the background. So if you want to use a different account to sign in, you're going to need to go to google.com or, use this tab here, this little drop down here within Google Chrome to log out, and then you're going to go through the process of logging in with a different user, and you'll need to provide the password and everything. So we have a user. We want to fetch them and obviously show different content to show our actual application instead of our login component now. How are we going to do that? How are we going to interact with our auth service and fetch our currently authenticated user? Well, we're going to be using a package that we've already installed called React Firebase Hooks, which gives us a bunch of really nice, convenient custom hooks for Firebase. These are hooks that we could create on our own, but it's really just a lot easier for our development that these are already made for us, ready-made for us to be able to fetch information about our currently authenticated user. And you'll see that there are different types of hooks as well for Cloud Firestore, for our database, as well as for storage and the real-time database. So these are going to help us out a lot, and what we're going to be using right now to fetch our user. And when we fetch our user and display them within our application and show different content, we also want to interact with our database. So this is one thing I want to return to the Firebase console to show you. So we're in the authentication tab right now, and only in the authentication tab is this user information stored. We logged in, but Firestore, our Firestore database, which we have yet to set up, knows nothing about it. So let's head to the Firestore database tab and select Create Database. And we want to start in test mode to be able to allow all reads and writes to our database. And we also want to set our Cloud Firestore location. and you want to choose the location that's closest to you. And if we were providing this for actual users, we want it to be close to where our users or most of our users are going to be. So we'll select that and then hit enable. So as I briefly mentioned earlier, once our database has been provisioned, you'll see that we can interact with our database and see how it's structured. So instead of columns and tables, since it's a NoSQL database, Firestore has this idea of collections and documents. So we have a collection or a set of data. You can think of it like an array. And whenever we fetch a collection, that's exactly what we're going to be getting back is an array of data. We have collections, and then each of those individual items within a collection is a document. So we're going to have a collection that is of users. So it's going to have an ID of users, simple enough. And once we add it, once we have such a collection, we can kind of see it like it's a folder structure. We go into /users, and then we can add all of our documents within that users collection, within that users array again, so to speak. And each of these elements or documents are going to have their own ID as well as their own field. You can think of these like properties on an object with their own value, and Firestore has its own respective types that are a little bit different, just a tiny bit different than normal JavaScript types. You can see that there's one for timestamp and geopoint and reference, but the ones at the top are very similar to JavaScript data types that we're familiar with. So we're going to be able to structure this in any way that we like. We don't need to describe the structure of it beforehand. It's very much a very changeable, mutable structure. And within one neat thing is that once we have a collection and it has a particular document, which we could add, I'm not going to add it right now. You'll see this as we add our first collection and document in just a minute when we move our user data here into its own collection in our database. But each document can have its own collection as well. So you can have very deeply nested paths, and it really can be as deep as you need it to be. But just know that it goes first collection, then document, then back to collection. So you'll become more familiar with this as we start interacting with our data and look at our database. So what are we going to do here? Well, let's navigate back to our application. Remember that we're showing login in any event, and we're not showing the rest of the app. We only want to show this login component when we don't have a user. So how do we fetch the user? Well, we use React Firebase hooks. And if we look, right now I'm on the NPM page for React Firebase hooks. You can go to the following URL and bring this up. But I'm going to go to the documentation at the bottom and select auth hooks. Here we're going to, if we scroll down, we're going to see pretty clear examples of how to use each hook to be able to fetch the data that we need. And note that this is primarily for fetching data. We're going to see how to change data and update collections and documents, but it's not going to be through hooks. So what we need is actually this first one, which is use auth state. Naturally, we want the current user, and the hook wraps around a familiar method, a method you might be familiar with if you've used Firebase before. It's the unauth state change method. So this is going to give you a live value for our currently authenticated user. We just need to pass in the auth module, the auth service, and it's going to return to us an array which we can destructure, and we'll get user, loading, and error. To test this out, we can just copy this example that we have here. We can copy the import, and we want to put it up at the top of app, as well as the hook and how it's called. We're going to bring in auth, import auth from /Firebase, and here we really just need the user. So only if we don't have the user are we going to return login. Else, we don't need really an else condition because what's after if is going to run. In any case, we're going to display the app, and that's where we're going to use and display the user data. So let's go ahead and console log that and see if this works. So we'll head to our app, And right away, we can see that it's working because we're no longer seeing our login component. And if we right-click, hit inspect, and look at our console, we can, if we go to the console tab, we can see that we have an object here, and we have our user data, and we can see a bunch of properties, and within it, we can see the user's email, their ID from the UID property, as well as some additional metadata, plus a very helpful photo URL that Google has automatically created for each one of its users. So we're going to use all this helpful information to display and work with our user data within our app. The benefit of using these custom hooks from React Firebase hooks is that they really cut down on the amount of code that we have to write to interact with Firestore or the different services that we're interacting with, the auth or the storage modules. Now, we can certainly use these hooks directly within our components. However, remember that we need to take the currently authenticated user and put it within a collection in our newly created Firestore database. So we're going to have some additional logic, some additional code to be able to do that. To first make sure our user exists and then add them to our Firestore database. So we're going to need to put this in a better location, or at least it's a better practice to put this in a different location rather than cluttering our app component with all of this code. And plus, if we extract this into a separate function, into a separate hook, we're going to be able to use it very easily if we need to across our application. So instead of using use auth state right here, and note that we can really cut down on the imports because we just imported 2 additional things within our app component. So this really allows us to separate our concerns. We can use a hook that's within our hooks folder called use auth user. We do want to get the auth state, but specifically we just want to get our current user and then pass them down to our app, to every child component within app that we're going to place within app. So we can, first of all, take our imports, auth, use auth state, and then place them up at the top of use auth user. And then, since this is a hook that we're creating, use auth user, we can call another hook up at the top of it. So we can call use auth state and get back our user here. Now, we have our user, but we want to interact with our database. So we want to make a request to our database and first of all see if this current user exists in it. If not, we want to add them to our database. Pretty simple. And the way that we can do that, provided we have a user, is with the help of useEffect. So we can bring in React, and we're going to bring in or import React so that we can use the useEffect hook because we're going to be performing a side effect. We're going to be reaching out using the Firebase SDK, specifically the DB module, in order first to query for a certain document according to the user, and then adding data if it's necessary. So first of all, we want to check to see that we have a user. We don't want to run this function if we don't have one. And it's also dependent upon that user data. So if that user data were to change, we want to run this function again. So if we have a user, how are we going to query for a particular document based off of the user's ID? Well, we can bring in DB, which is a reference to Firestore. And what's great about Firestore and our understanding that we just gained about collections and documents is that it's very straightforward to understand and make our own queries with Firestore because there are methods that correspond exactly to what we want. So as I mentioned, we're going to have a collection with the name users. That's where all of our user data is going to be stored in. So we just need to say db.collection and reference that path with the string users. And each user document within that array of that list of user data, we're going to be able to find it according to the user's ID, again from the UID property. So this doesn't actually perform the query just yet. There's different ways of doing it. We can just make a simple get request or one-time fetch operation just to get the data once, or we can use what's called a snapshot. We can use the onSnapshot method in order to get a live query. Right now, we just want to get it once, but we can't get it yet because first we have to use this reference. So really querying or interacting with Firestore consists of creating a ref and then figuring out which operation we want to perform. Whether we want to get something, whether we want to get a snapshot that is a live query, or we want to set some new data. We're going to be doing all those operations here. Not exactly here, but within our app. So we have this reference to a certain document. We want to get it. We just want to get it once. So how do we do that? Well, we say ref.get, and get returns a promise. And then we want to say then. We're within the useEffect hook. We can't use an async function, so we'll just use then to resolve this promise. We're going to get back a document. And for right now, let's just console log this document. And also, we want to make sure that we're importing Firebase correctly. It's from one level up. So get returns a promise. We're resolving it with then, and we're getting back a document, or what Firebase calls, or Firestore calls, a document snapshot. So let's console log that, refresh, but we don't see anything yet. Why? Well, we need to call this hook. So instead of having use auth state, we're just going to call use auth user. We can remove these two unused imports, and the way to do that with a very neat shortcut is the command Shift Option O. It immediately reorganizes all of our imports and removes any unused imports, and we can here just import directly use auth user from hooks/use auth user. Right now we're just going to call it, and we're going to remove this conditional since we don't have any user data just yet. We'll save that, and we're going to get back this object, which consists of some strange properties, delegate and Firestore. We can ignore those. What's important for us are these fields here. ID, the ID of this document, and primarily whether it exists. So we're checking to see if a given user exists in our database according to a user ID. Of course, they don't just yet, so false. It does not exist. That document doesn't exist yet, so we need to create it. Now, one other thing that's important to note about this object is that we can get the data. If we look at its prototype, there is this data property to get all the information there. We're not going to need that just yet, but we're going to be using it a lot to fetch every document's data. So we can use a conditional and say if not doc.exists. If it doesn't exist, then we want to use that reference, and this is the benefit of storing it within a variable. We can use the set method by saying ref.set. This adds a new document to our collection, and remember, we can think of documents like objects with their own properties and values, so we want to set a new object, a new document onto our users collection with the name coming from user.displayname, a photo URL from user.photo URL, and a timestamp. And for this, we can use the create timestamp function. You can import that from Firebase for when the user was created. And then finally, now that we're performing this action of adding them to our database, we can just return the user at the end. So this allows us back within app just to call useauth user, get back our user, still have our conditional, and we can save both of our files. And I use the command or the keyboard shortcut command option or control option S to save all of my files at once. We'll refresh. So we see our app, and then if we go to Firestore, we might need to refresh. We see a new users collection, so that was automatically created, and then we added a document. You can see a collection is linked to a document according to an auto-generated ID, and for this document, which we see here, we have the name of the logged in user, their photo URL, and the timestamp when they were created. Now that we've got our first user added to our Firestore database, let's head back to our app component and start filling it out a little bit. So there's really only going to be two major components within the main screen in our application when a user's logged in. We're just going to have a sidebar area over here where a user can toggle through all of the different menu items that we have. They're going to be able to look at their chats, their rooms, public rooms that have been created, as well as users that they're having a direct conversation with. Oh, and also to be able to search through different rooms. We're going to have all those tabs within the sidebar, which we're going to work on right now. And we're also going to have a chat area. So whenever we select a certain chat, they're going to see it on the right-hand side. Now, the first thing that we want to display up at the top of the sidebar is not any of the menu options. We don't have those just yet, but we want to display the user's name, their profile picture, as well as a logout button. So we're going to head to app, the app component, and here within app, we're going to add a div with the class name app body, and within it is going to be our sidebar component. So we want to import this, and we're going to pass down a couple of props. We want to pass down the user data as well as this page data. We're going to be using page across our app to appropriately style some certain some components, some elements. And if you look at this page value, it's coming from use window size, and it's giving us, it's just a simple hook that I created, and it's giving us the width, height of the page, as well as whether we're on a mobile screen, so that we can appropriately display our components and make sure that they're the right size. But right now, back within app, we just want to import our sidebar component. So that's also going to be from the components folder, from ./components/sidebar. We'll pass down both of those props, user and page, and then we can jump into that component. So let's destructure from our props object both of those values that we're passing down, user and page. And within this div, with the class name of sidebar, we're first going to include a div, the class name of sidebar header. Within that, a div, the class name of sidebar header --left. So these aren't underscores, they are dashes according to the BEM convention. Here we're going to use the avatar component from Material UI. Again, that's going to be from Material UI core. So this is going to be all of the core components, and the other dependency, Material UI icons, is logically all of the icons, Material UI icons that it includes. So for avatar, we're going to set the source, and remember that on our user data, we have a photo URL property. We're going to be using the optional chaining operator to first make sure that we have our user, because remember, back within useauth user, it's quite possible that we don't have it just yet since this is an asynchronous operation. So we want to make sure that we have our user first before getting our photo URL, so we're not trying to get a property from an undefined value, which would result in an error. So after this avatar, we're going to have an h4, which is going to, again, using the user, use the display name property. And then under this div, or I should say as a sibling of this div, we're going to have sidebar header right, and this will include an icon button component. This is a button component meant to function as a button, but include or contain an icon. So let's have an onClick connected to a function called signout. So let's just go ahead and create that. Above the return, we won't add any content or a body to it just yet. And we want to add an icon exit to app as a child of that component. And finally, for the parent div, the div with the class of sidebar, we're going to add a style object so we can set the min height property based off of whether we are on mobile. So if page.isMobile, if that value is true, we want the complete height of this sidebar to the page height, to the height of the window, or if users are on a mobile device, the height of the device. Otherwise, have that property just set to auto. So let's save that and see how it looks currently. So when our page loads, we can see our sidebar area here on the left. We can see the avatar of our current user, their name, as well as our sign out button. So to make this functional, we're once again going to use the auth variable. We'll import auth from /Firebase. So to sign out, all we need to do is say auth dot sign out. So we can test this. And once we hit the button, we should be taken right back to our login component, after which we can log in once again. One necessity of our application, as well as any application that you make, is that it needs to be responsive. It needs to work for mobile and desktop devices. If we make our page smaller in width, we can see that the sidebar takes up the complete width of the page. So we can really only see the sidebar or the chat area at a time. The way that we're going to be able to manage what our user sees on mobile in particular is with the help of different routes. So when a user's on a mobile device, they're going to be able to see just this sidebar, and then they can select a given chat, and we're going to have each of those chats live on their own unique URL so that we can see just the chat area instead of the sidebar area. So in other words, the sidebar area needs to live in a different place than the chat area. And the same applies even for the desktop view. We want to both kind of see the sidebar and go through the different options here, but still have this, the chat component, exist on its own separate route according to its ID. So how do we do that? Well, we need to, in order to have routes, we need to set up a router. The router that we're going to be using is React Router DOM. We set this up within our index.js file, and we want to wrap it around our app component. But first we need to have our provider, and that provider is called Browser Router. So this is for any web-based router, any web-based application. This is a specific router just for the browser, and usually we alias this just to the name router, just to make it a little bit more succinct from React Router DOM. So in most every case when you're building a web app, you want to use the browser router. So we want to wrap the app component, our entire component tree, with router. So it uses context to give it access, our application now, to properties like history, to be able to manage history, to go back and forward in history, to go back and forward in the pages that our user navigates to and from, and keep track of them. So heading back to app, this is where we're going to be setting up our different routes, and every route has to be within the router. So as we mentioned, we're going to have this chat area here on the right-hand side and the sidebar area, which are going to exist on different routes. So underneath sidebar, we're going to create a route. So this is a component of the name route from React Router DOM. And first of all, we need to specify what path, what the route is, what it's going to look like. So we use the path prop. Again, since this is a React component, we set the path to whatever we want it to be. And since our different chats are going to be referred to as rooms, we'll have it begin with room/room ID. Now, the reason this is prefixed with a colon is that this is a dynamic route. We're going to change the end of this route according to the chat that we're looking at, its ID. So we can access this room ID value within our chat component to be able to fetch the appropriate room data. We'll see how to do that later. But for right now, we're going to bring in our chat component. We'll import that up at the top. And we also want to pass down our two values, page and user, to it. User and then page. So now chat, we haven't filled out this component just yet, but it's going to exist on its own route. And additionally, for our main application, we're going to do something a little bit different when we're on mobile. We want to redirect our user when we're on mobile to, instead of just /, so right now we're on the home page, which is usually denoted with just a /, we want to send users to chats, the path /chats. So it's going to be slightly different on mobile than it is on desktop. So if we detect that a user's on mobile or using a mobile device, we want to redirect from / to just to /chats. And just like the route component, and what's great about React Router DOM is that this is component based, which makes sense as it's a React library. We can use the redirect component just like we would any other React component, which is makes it very intuitive to work with. So we'll bring in redirect, and normally we'd think of redirect as just being a function that we have to call, but we can just put redirect right within our component and within our JSX and set its to value. So instead of path, we want to redirect to, and this is going to be according to page.isMobile. If we're on mobile, we want that to be chats, plural. Otherwise, if we're on desktop or a larger device, we just want it to be /. So you can see this in action. If we go back to our app and reload the page, we see currently we're on just /, but if we make it smaller, immediately once we're on a mobile breakpoint, it goes to chats. So that keeps it separate from any chat that we want to take a look at. And if we were to go to room / whatever unique ID, we would just see the text chat. Let's focus on our sidebar component and add a couple of major parts to it aside from the menu functionality that we just talked about. We're going to include a search input up at the top so users can search through different user chats that they're part of or different public rooms, as well as we're going to have a button for users to be able to click on it and then add a public room to chat with any users that they like. So we want to head into our sidebar component, and we're going to go underneath our sidebar header, underneath this div, so I'll collapse it. And you can see that the next part that we're going to add is our search form. So we're going to have a div with the class of sidebar search, and within it a form element, which will have a class of sidebar search container. We're going to have a search icon from Material UI icons. So we'll bring in the component search outlined from that dependency. Then we're going to have one input in our form with the placeholder text, search for users or rooms. This will have the type of text and an ID of search. Then after this div, at the very bottom of the component, we're going to include the add room button. So this will be within a div with the class name of sidebar chat add room. Once again, we're going to use the icon button component, and it's going to consist of the add icon, which we'll bring in from Material UI icons as well. So with all of that, we can save and take a look at the result. So great, we have this search input up at the top, and we have an add room button where users are going to be able to click on this, and we're going to have a prompt that will show, that will appear. Users will just be able to type the name of the room that they want to create, hit enter, and then it will be created and then included within the Rooms tab that we're going to have here in the menu, which we'll add in the very next video. Our sidebar component is going to consist of a number of different links up at the top so we can see different rooms that the user is in. The first tab is going to be for seeing all the chats that a user is in, any public room or any private conversation that they're having with another user in our app. The second tab is going to be for public rooms that are created using the add room button that we just made. And the last tab is for seeing all of the other users in our app that we can start a conversation with that are not us. So we want to create these tabs up at the top to see the different sets of data, these different collections, and display them. But note that the way that we're going to set up these tabs or nav links, since we're going to need to toggle one or the other, the way that they're going to work on a mobile device versus a desktop device is different. So when we're on a desktop device, we're going to stay on the same page. However, when we're on a mobile device and we're just seeing the sidebar component, it covered the entire page, we're going to toggle between different routes. So all of our chats, and when the chat tab is active, we're going to be on the route /chats. When we click on the tab to see all rooms, we're going to go to the route /rooms. When we click on the users tab, that will be users. So we're going to need these different nav links to function as links on a mobile device, while on a desktop or a larger device, they're just going to change a piece of state to conditionally show one or another part of our menu, one or another set of data. So we need to set up some conditional logic to either use a link or a regular component. So first of all, we want to create a piece of state that's going to control what menu our user sees. So we're going to make sure that we bring in React and call useState. And by default, we want the first menu item, the chats, to be selected. So we will give that a value of 1, and we're going to have the values 1, 2, 3, and 4 to see each one of our tabs, and our search results is going to be the 4th tab. So we're going to call this menu, this piece of state menu, and the setter will be set menu. But for right now, we want to create a nav component that's either a link or is just going to update this menu value. So we want to create a variable, and it's going to have a capital N at the beginning. We're going to call it nav, and it'll have a capital N because this is going to hold a component. If we're on a mobile device, if page.isMobile, then we want this to be a navlink component. Navlink is a component that we can import from React Router DOM. We usually navigate around our different pages using the link component. However, navlink allows us to set up some active classes so we can apply a certain class when it's selected, and our user can see that it's selected. So when we're on a mobile device, nav is going to be set to navlink. It's going to be a regular link. Otherwise, we want it to be a component. So we want to set nav to a component that returns some JSX, it will receive some props when we use this component. And this is going to consist of a div, and it's going to have a class name which will be set conditionally. So we're going to use a ternary, and if on the props object there's a class called active class, we want to, if this has a value of true, we want to set the class to sidebar menu selected, otherwise nothing. And additionally, we're going to get from props a function which we'll call when a user clicks on this div, as well as some children. So anything that we wrap the nav tags around, the nav component around, is going to be displayed. If this looks confusing now, it'll make a lot more sense as we create these different tabs. So to create them, we're going to go underneath sidebar search and make another div with the class name of sidebar menu. So for our first nav or nav link, it's going to have a to value of /chats if we're on mobile. If we're not, we're going to have an onClick, which will be set to a function where we just want to set the menu value to 1. We're going to have an active class if the menu is set to 1, if in state it's equal to 1, and the active class name, which again is for the navlink component from React Router DOM, that will be the same as what we're applying above, conditionally, sidebar menu selected. And then for what we see as this first tab, we're going to have a div with the class name of sidebar menu home, which will consist of a icon with the name of home, which we will import. And after that will be a div with the class name sidebar menu line. Now let's just save this to briefly see what this looks like. Okay, great. So here's our first tab. Of course, it's selected because the default value in state for menu is 1. We're on a desktop device. If we go down to a mobile device, we see that this is selected as well because we're on the route /chats. However, if we look down at the very bottom, we can see that this is in fact a link if we hover over it. On a larger device, it is not. So since we have 2 more nav components that we need to include, 2 more tabs that we need to add, we can just copy and paste this 2 more times and just modify them slightly. So for the second link, for the second component, it's going to be 2/rooms. The onClick is going to set the menu value to 2. It's going to have an active class if menu is 2, and the div class name will be sidebar menu rooms with an icon of the message component. And finally, the last one is going to be 2/users. We're going to set menu to 3 and active class if menu is equal to 3. The class name sidebar menu users with the icon people alt. So once we add all of that code, should be able to toggle between each of these different tabs, both on mobile and desktop devices. Now, we ultimately want to see the appropriate data underneath. We're not going to be able to display that just yet since we don't have any rooms or other users to speak of. However, we can set up the boilerplate, the logic that we're going to need to have in order to display the appropriate thing. We're going to include the data in a later step, but for right now, if we go under this div with the class of sidebar menu, we're going to have a ternary where we're going to check to see if we're on a mobile device. If so, we want to switch between a number of different routes. So for that, we use the switch component. this is a component from React Router DOM which takes care of switching between the appropriate routes when we have many of them in a row. And we're going to be creating a number of them because, of course, we do have a link to all of these routes, but we have not declared them. So within switch, we're going to make a route that's going to have the path of /users. And what's going to be within this, what's going to contain the actual user data, well, we're going to display that within the sidebar list component. So we want to import that up at the top, import sidebar list from ./sidebar list. And let's make this in exactly the same order as our links just to make it more clear. So we'll have chats, rooms, users, and then finally we'll have search results. So we're going to copy this and paste it in 3 more times, and we'll begin with path of /chats, then /rooms, then /users, and after that /search. And then for the second part of our ternary, when we're not on a mobile device, we'll include a colon for the else conditions. We want to switch according to the value that's in state for menu, whichever menu that we have selected. So if the menu is equal to the value 1, we want to display a sidebar list component for all of our chat-related data. So right now, we are going to be passing down the appropriate data to each of these sidebar list components, so they all look the same right now, but they will have different props to display different data. Once again, we're just setting up the structure of this, the basic structure of this. But for each of these menu values 1 through 4, they're all going to display sidebar list. So if menu is equal to 1, that'll be return a sidebar list component. Or if menu is 2, we'll return the same. Or if menu is 3, or if menu is 4. And then finally, if none of these conditions are met, we're just going to show nothing, so we'll return null. And it looks like I'm getting an error because I have not imported the route component. So not only do we need to import switch, but we also need to import the route component once again. And we'll save. And right now we can toggle between each of these different tabs, and we still see sidebar list. And it should work both for mobile devices and for larger desktop devices. Within our sidebar list component, we're going to display the appropriate data, whether it's chats, public rooms, or individual conversations with other users. So we can begin in displaying the appropriate data here by adding the functionality to allow users to create a new room. So users will be able to create a public room by clicking on this Add Room button. A prompt will be displayed where they can type in the name of this public room where any user can join. It will be created, and then it will be added to the Rooms tab. So this functionality is going to be set up within our sidebar component, and it's going to take place whenever a user clicks on the icon button for Add Room. So we want to, when a user clicks, to create a room. So let's make a function above our conditional. We'll make a function called createRoom. And to show a prompt, to show a dialog, we can just use the function that's on the window object, prompt, and we can include a message, such as type the name of your room. So we're going to prompt our users to do so, and if they include a name and hit OK, it's going to be put within a variable, which we'll call room name. So if we have a room name, which doesn't just consist of white space, so we can say if room name.trim, we can bring in a reference to Firestore, so we can import db, and we can just add it to what we're importing from Firebase right after auth. So we'll bring in db, and we want to reference a new collection that we haven't created yet. So in addition to our users collection, we're going to have a sibling collection called rooms. So this is similar to the structure of our users collection. It's going to consist of individual documents, which include data about the room. So each room is going to be very simple in structure, very basic. So we're just going to say db.collection rooms, and to add a completely new document, we can use the add method just as well as set. So we can use add, and we can give it whatever properties we like. I'm going to include a name for mine. It'll be the room name that was provided, as well as a timestamp for when it was created. So once again, we'll bring in the function create timestamp and be sure to call it. To make sure that you import that. We don't really need to get back any information. We just want to have this new document added to our new collection. So let's save, and we'll try adding a new room. We'll just say my new room, hit OK. Of course, we're not going to see anything populated within our list just yet, our sidebar list. But if we go to Firestore and refresh, we can see a new collection, rooms, with its own unique ID connected to the document with the name that we typed in as well as the timestamp for when it was created. Now let's see how to fetch this entire collection of rooms, of public rooms that users can join, and display it within our Rooms tab. Once again, just like we did for use auth user, we can make use of the custom hooks that React Firebase Hooks gives us, in this case for Firestore instead of the auth module, and to make them more reusable, we can include them within our own custom hook. So if we take a look at the React Firebase Hooks documentation, and we look at the section for Cloud Firestore hooks, you'll see that it has a lot of useful hooks that allow us to work with collections and documents. You can see that there are a couple of different types of hooks: use collection versus use collection once, or use document versus use document once. Use document is going to allow us to use snapshots, a live snapshot, and what that means is it uses a feature of Firestore, the real-time part of Firestore, to be able to get data whenever it comes in. So whenever a new document is added or changed, or there's any change in our collection with either use collection or use document, we get the results immediately and can display them. Use document once is, say, when our component mounts, maybe we just want to fetch it once, or we want to fetch our data in response to one thing happening, such as a change in our data. We're going to be using use collection and use document a great deal, and this is as compared to use collection data and use document data. And you can see their variants: use collection data once and use document data once. This allows us to get the data immediately as compared to use collection and use document, where they give us a snapshot. They give us more information, and you might recall them if we go back to use auth user, that custom hook, you could see that from document, what we were calling doc, it's actually a document snapshot. What a snapshot gives us is metadata, like the document ID and whether it exists. This is important. The reason that this is important is, in many cases, we're going to need IDs because we're going to be displaying lists. We're going to need IDs to work as keys for React to display our list appropriately. We're also going to need IDs to identify our different documents. So IDs are going to be important, and this metadata is going to be important for us. So we are going to be working with document snapshots rather than just the data. That's what use collection data and use document data would give us. So with all that being said, we want live queries and we also want to be working with snapshots instead of just the data. We can head to the new hook that we're going to be using. If we take a look at the Explorer, we want to display, for right now, use rooms, all of the documents that are within the rooms collection. So we won't need to pass in any arguments to this hook. We're just going to need two things similar to what we had with useAuthUser. We're going to need the appropriate hook from React Firebase hooks. And if we go to the documentation, since we're working with the collection, we're going to be calling useCollection. So to import that, we're going to import useCollection from React Firebase hooks / Firestore within useRooms. And we're also going to need a reference to DB to work with Firestore from one level up. So for useCollection, it also returns an array, which we can destructure. We're really just going to need access to the snapshot. We could add some different logic if we were handling loading and errors. Generally speaking, we don't need to, but if we really wanted to make this the best app it could be, we would handle both of those states. We're just going to assume in most every case that it resolves successfully. So we're going to call useCollection, and just like we did for useAuthUser, at least when we were setting a new document, we need to create a reference. That's what useCollection and useDocument need. What is the reference to the collection? What are we fetching? So we'll use that reference to Firestore, and then we're going to just, again, use our familiar methods of collection and doc. So for useCollection, we can say db.collection rooms, and we want to order them by, so this is a new method. We can also chain on methods that allow us to order the data that's returned, order the collection, and this is the significance of including a timestamp. The benefit of this is that we can pass in a first argument of the field that we want to order by, and whether we want it to be an ascending ASC or descending. In other words, from newest to oldest or oldest to newest. In our case, we're going to use it, filter the data or order the data in descending order. And what we're going to get back is our snapshot. And all we have to do is, provided we have a snapshot, so once again we can use the optional chaining operator if we have the snapshot and we're not in a loading or error state. What snapshot gives us is a number of documents, an array of all the documents in the query snapshot. Since this is just a basic array, we can map over this. We can map over each document, and we can immediately return it. We're using the implicit return by wrapping an additional set of parentheses around this object. And first we want to get the document ID from doc.id. We're going to put that on a property called user ID as well. And to get all of the data, remember, if you might remember when we looked at the document snapshot in the past, there was also a data method on the prototype. This gives us all of the different fields on each document. So we could say document.data, and instead of grabbing the properties individually, we might not know exactly what they are. And since this is a NoSQL database that they can change, they're not as rigidly structured as other databases. Instead of doing that, we can just spread in everything that we get back from this function by using the object spread operator. So all of those properties and values are going to be spread into this new object, and we're going to put the result in a variable called rooms and then return it. Simple as that. So we're using the useCollection hook. We're making a reference to the rooms collection. We're ordering it in descending order from newest to oldest. This gives us a snapshot. If we have it, we get an array of documents. We iterate over it with map and return a new array that consists of a number of objects as elements, where we have an ID, user ID property, and the rest of the properties from doc.data spread into each of these elements in the array that's returned from map. We call that rooms, and then we return it. So finally, the last step is calling it up at the top of sidebar. So here we can use rooms and make sure to import it from our hooks folder, call it with no arguments, and we're going to get back our rooms data. And for right now, let's just console log the result. So if we open our console, you can see originally, or at first, it's undefined, and then we're given an array of rooms, consists of one item. It consists of the ID, the name, timestamp, and the user ID. And so in the next step, we're going to see how to display that within the appropriate Rooms tab. Now that we have rooms to work with, we have our rooms collection, let's start displaying them here within our sidebar list. Now, we're going to need to pass down some different props. We're going to need to pass down the data, such as the rooms data, to the appropriate tab. So in this case, since we're getting just all of the publicly created rooms, they're going to be within this middle tab. We're going to display not only the data, but the title up at the top, and then the data as a list underneath. And that's what we're using the sidebar list component for. So since we have that, we can pass it down to the appropriate tab. So if we scroll down, you'll see in the area here where we have our ternary, where we've set up all of our routes, we want to start passing down the appropriate data through props to sidebar list. So we're going to start here with the chats route, and as we mentioned, we're going to have two props. We're going to have one, the title, so the title will be set to chats, and the data, we don't have this just yet, but this will be all of the chats data. So we can copy this, and then for rooms, we do actually have the rooms data. So that's within the rooms variable from our use rooms hook. The title, however, will be rooms instead of chats. For users, title will be users. We'll leave data as an empty array, and then for search, that will be search results. Then for menu 1, that will be for chats, menu 2 for rooms with the rooms data, then users, and once again, search results. Now, if we save, we're not going to see any changes. That's because we haven't filled out our sidebar list component. So let's go there, and we want to receive both of these props individually, so we can destructure the props object and grab title and data. It's important if we don't have any data, if not data, we want to return a loading spinner. We're going to assume that we're in a loading state. So we want to return a div with the class name of loader container as well as sidebar loader. We're going to use a circular progress component from material UI core. And if we do have data, but maybe we don't have any items. So if we don't have any items, if not data.length, and if our title is search results, so our user is attempting to search for something, we want to display that no results came back. So in this case, we want to return a div with the class name of no result. Within it will be a div which will include the icon search outlined, which we'll import. Then a div with the class name of cancel-root, and this will have the icon cancel outlined. And then right before the closing div, we'll use an H2 and say no title. So whatever the user searched for, we'll say no search results. And then finally, we'll return a div with the class name of sidebar chat container, which we already have. Up at the top, we'll show an H2 with the appropriate title. Then we're going to take data, since it's an array, and map over it. We're going to map over each item, what we'll call each item, and we're going to display the sidebar list item component. So let's import that. Might need to do so manually. Sidebar list item from /sidebar list item. And since we're iterating over this, we're going to need to provide a key prop, and that'll be set to item.id. We will have a prop called item, so we'll pass down all of the data on that, and we're going to pass down the title one more level. So let's go into sidebar list item. And I take that back. We actually don't need to pass down the title here. We're just going to need to destructure item. And instead of this div that we have here, we're going to use a link, the link component from React Router DOM. So users are going to be able to click on this and go to the chat, the appropriate room that's listed within sidebar list. So we'll replace the div with a link component. It'll still have the class name of link, and within it, and I should say, it'll also have a to prop. This will be set to the dynamic value of /room/item.id. Remember, all the way back in app, we set up a route which had the path of /room/roomid. So using the link component here, we're navigating to that page. Within link, we're going to include a div with the class name of sidebar chat. Within that will be a div with the class name of avatar container. So we'll have an avatar component from Material UI core, which we'll need to import. And this is going to have some inline style properties. We'll set the width to 45 and the same for the height. And here we want to set the source to item.photo URL. And if that doesn't exist, for whatever reason, we will have a photo URL if a user is chatting with another user. Since Google supplies that photo URL from the user, for the user, we're going to include one that we create based off of its ID. So it'll include just a little graphic figure of a person, and we're going to use the URL avatars.dicebear.com/api/human/item.id.svg. And then after the avatar container div, we'll include another with the class name of sidebar chat info, which will include an H2 with just the item's name. So let's save both of these components and we'll check for any errors. And assuming that we're passing down everything appropriately, and I misspelled dice bear. Assuming we're passing down everything appropriately, we should see our room, our new room displayed here within the Rooms tab with its unique image, chats. We should see the title, and same for users. However, we don't have any data for that just yet. That's what we'll take care of in the next few videos. We're fetching our Rooms collection and displaying it within the Rooms tab. Now let's see how to create a custom hook to display all of the users that our current user can chat with. So we're going to make another hook within our hooks folder, and this is called use users. Now what this hook is going to be dependent upon, we're going to need to pass to it when we execute this hook, is the current user data. So of course we could call use auth user up at the top in order to get that user data, or if we think about where we're going to call this within our sidebar component, we already have access to it through props. So whenever we call use users, which we can go ahead and import, we're going to pass to it the user data, the current user. So let's go ahead and import use users. So we're going to get that, and we're going to get back a collection of users. Now, thinking about this critically, we're going to need to get all the users within our users collection that are not the current user. So since we already have a collection of users, this is going to be fairly easy to fetch. We only have one user at the moment, but we'll create another in this step. So we're going to once again bring in use collection from React Firebase hooks. And here we're going to make a reference to the users collection. So we're going to need to bring in DB in order to make that reference from Firebase. And once again, we want to order according to the timestamp that the user was created in descending order. And we're going to get back a snapshot. So in this case, it's not going to be just as simple as with use rooms. We were iterating over the docs with map. We need to check a couple of things first. We first need to check and see if we actually have a user. So provided we have a snapshot, we can iterate over all the documents, but we're going to iterate over it with for each. We're going to iterate over each document, and not only do we want to make sure that the current document's ID is not equal to the current user's ID, so we want to make sure that doc.id is not equal to user.uid, but we also want to create a special ID for each of these users. Why? Well, because we're just going to create a unique conversation between one user and another. So we're going to make this ID a composite of those two IDs, the doc ID, which is just another user's ID, and the current user's ID. So this is the way that we're going to structure them. This ID is going to be created based off of whether the user, their ID, and this should all be within for each, if their ID is greater than the current user's ID. If that's the case, we'll make a string where doc.id is first, and then we'll put user, the current user's ID at the end, or if the current user's ID is actually more than the other user's ID, then we'll just invert them, where current user's ID is first and then the other user's ID. So in that case, we're iterating over each document, and we're going to collect all of these users into an array which we'll call users. It'll be set to an empty array at first, and we're going to push each new document onto this array with users.push, that array method. So we'll push on a document or an object with ID. User ID will be set to doc.id, and then we're also going to spread in our document data at the end. And then finally from this hook, we're going to return users. So now we can save both of these files, and we can, back within sidebar, since we're getting our users, we can pass that to the appropriate sidebar list components. So if we scroll all the way down to our users route, we can pass in the data as users, and then also when the menu is equal to 3, we'll pass in data as users there as well. So we'll save sidebar, and as I mentioned, we don't have any other users currently, so I'm going to take a second and create a new user. I'll log out and create a new user and log back in with my current user here. So I've created a new user, and now if we switch to the Users tab, we can see them right here in our list. And once we click on them, we're going to see the room with the ID at the very end. You can see it's a composite of the two users' IDs, the current user and that user's ID. And once we create the chat component, we're going to actually be able to chat with them directly. The last tab that we need to fill out is the Chats tab. And this is going to include all of the rooms that we're a part of, as well as any user conversations that we're a part of. So we're going to create a special hook called use chats, which is also going to require user data. It's going to be executed within the sidebar component. So we're going to call use chats and pass in the user data, and we're going to get back the data in a variable which we'll call chats. So we'll make sure to import this hook, and then we're going to be fetching some collection data from a nested collection where I'll just draw it out here. We're going to, within our users collection, we're going to have for each user a sub-collection called chats. And this is going to consist of all of the individual messages that a given user has created within each one of these rooms or private user chats. So the structure of this is going to be users, and then the user ID, chats, and that is going to be the collection that we are returning here. So we're not going to have this added just yet because it's going to be added to this chats collection only when we're able to create a message, which we'll see how to do very soon. But for right now, we're going to use the collection hook. Once again, bring that in, and we're going to bring in DB as well. So we're going to say db.collection users. So we will auto import that. We're going to select the document user.uid, and then the nested or the sub-collection chats, and once again we're going to order it by the timestamp in descending order. And then there's one important thing to note here. Since we are using a property of user in use chats, what's going to happen if we don't have the user? Well, we're going to have an error because we can't pass null or undefined to a document. It has to exist. So the way to use this reference to perform our collection query is that we first need to use a ternary before using this reference. We need to make sure that the user's there, in which case we can use this reference, which references the user UID. Otherwise, we can just pass in null and the query won't be performed. So if it is performed successfully, we get back our snapshot, and in this case we'll create an array called chats, and we can take the snapshot and iterate over it with docs, with map, and we can return a document. For each of these elements, we can return an object. We can spread in doc.data, and we'll set the ID to doc.id. And in fact, I just realized since we're using map, we don't have to put the variable declaration up here. We can just directly set that to chats. We don't have to initialize it to an empty array. And we can return chats. If you wanted to be even more succinct, you could just return all of this. There are many ways to write this, of course, but this seems to be the most clear, transparent way to me. So we're executing use chats. We don't have any chats collection on any users just yet, but we'll see that this in fact works when we're able to send messages. We'll just have to kind of take it on faith for now. So we're going to pass down that chats array, which will just be empty for the time being, to the route, the sidebar list component within the route with the path of /chats, and then when the menu is equal to 1. So we'll save both of these components. And in the next step, we'll see how to perform a search for a given user or a public room. As compared to the custom hooks that we've been creating, the next query that we're going to be performing is going to be directly within the sidebar component. We're going to make it possible for a given user to search for another user based off of their name, or we can also search for a room based off of its name. So how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to use this search form that we created directly within sidebar. You can see that it has the class of sidebar search. And when it's submitted, we're going to perform a request to search for both users and rooms according to the text that was typed in. So what's going to be the first step here? Well, we need to capture that form submission. So we need to add an onSubmit to take care of the submit event. And we want to pass a reference to a new function that will perform that search. And we're going to call that search users and rooms. And we're going to put this above the conditional that we have here. And this is going to receive the event that onSubmit gives it. And we're going to make this an async function. You'll see why in a second. But for right now, we want to prevent the default action when a form is submitted using event.preventDefault, which is to reload the page to make a request to our server. We don't want to do that. We want to control this with JavaScript. So we want to just continue with this function, and we want to next get the search value. So you can see we have an input here with an ID of search. You can copy that because it's very easy using a form once it's submitted to be able to get the value that's typed into any element if it has an ID or a name attribute. We can get it from the property event.target, which is the form.elements, which is the children of the form, .search, so there will be properties corresponding to the ID of the name attribute if it's set. So that's the same as the string that we typed, .search, .value. And we're going to put this in a variable called query. This was the search query. And now we want to perform a couple of queries, a couple of requests based off of the users and rooms collections to see whether there is a name of any room or user that matches what was typed in. So how do we write these? And why did we make this an async function? Well, we want to now perform a GET request. We want to make a one-time request to Firestore to check to see if a given document matches the query. So to do that, we want to perform a GET request using the GET method that we chain at the very end of a reference, and that returns a promise. So we're going to need to await the following. We want to await db.collection and reference the users collection. We'll search first on the users collection, and we can use the where method. This is a new filtering method that we haven't come across just yet, but it allows us to write a comparison between one value or another using some operator. We want to find the user where the name field is equal, so we can use an operator that Firestore gives us for where the double equals operator. You can see a list of them here. With our IntelliSense, you can see that you can have greater than, not equal to, less than or equal to, etc. But we want equal to if the name is equal to what the user typed in and what query is set to. So where the name is equal to query, we want to get that. So at the very end of this reference, we're going to chain on the get method. Again, as I said, this returns a promise, which resolves to a query snapshot. So we're going to get the result back in a variable which we'll call user snapshot. And we can just copy this line and do basically the same thing for rooms. In this case, we're going to perform the same where operation for each room where the name is equal to query. We want to get that, but in this case, we'll call it the room snapshot. So we want to get any user results as well as any room results. So first we want to, since this is a snapshot, we want to iterate over user snapshot.docs, where for each document we return an object where the ID is set to doc.id. Then we can spread in doc.data, and we'll put the results of this, all of those documents, in a variable called user results. We can do something identical for room snapshot, where we'll take that snapshot and put it in a variable called room results. Finally, we can put both of these, if we have two arrays, we can take both arrays and put it into one array with the help of the array spread operator. So we can spread in all the individual elements of user results and room results into one new array and put it in a variable called search results. After doing this, we want to display them in its appropriate menu option. So we want to set the menu to 4. And additionally, we want to set some state. So we're going to have a setter called set search results. We're kind of doing this in a backwards fashion, but let's create some state with the useState hook. Initially, this will be an empty array, and the state variable is going to be called search results, and the setter will be set search results. So this allows us at the end of our function to call set search results with just this array. We'll pass that in. And finally, once that is put in state, we'll take that search results, that updated search results array, and pass it down to its appropriate sidebar list components on the data prop. And when we hit save and we navigate back and search for a given user that exists and hit enter, we can see that in the search results. And if we search for a given room, you can see that's displayed and overwrites the previous search results as well. Right now, whenever we click on a given room, whether it's from our Rooms or our Users tab, we can see that the URL changes and we can see the chat component, but we don't see any of the data. So we want to be able to use this ID that's within our path in order to fetch the appropriate data, whether it's user data or room data. We want to go within the chat component and use or create a custom hook that's going to be able to fetch the data and display it. Now, what is it going to display? We want to display up at the top the name of the room as well as the image associated with it. So we're going to head into the chat component in the components folder, and we're going to execute a new hook that we haven't created yet called use room, singular. So we're going to grab that from the hooks folder. We can see if we can automatically import it. And what this is going to rely on, if we head back to our app component, you can see that we're displaying chat. It's connected to a route to the /room/room ID, and we're passing down user and page data. Made a mistake there. User and page data as props. So we can destructure both of those, user and page. UseRoom is going to rely upon two things: user data to get the user's ID if we're looking at a user room, a chat that we're having with one user, or we're going to need the room ID, which is included within the URL. So how do we get both of these values? The user ID is going to be available through props, and the room ID is going to be accessible by using a special hook called useParams from React Router DOM. All we have to do is call it, and we get back an object which includes any parameters associated with a given route. So since chat is within the declared route and it has a parameter of room ID, that object is going to contain a property which we can destructure called room ID. And we can pass down these two values to the useRoom hook, room ID, and then the user ID, which is going to be from user.uid. And we're going to get back all of the room data. So let's head into useRoom, and we'll make sure to include both of those once we're there, to include both of those parameters, room ID, user ID. So what are we going to need to do first? Well, we want to determine which collection we need to query for. In this case, when we get a room, we're getting a document rather than an entire collection. But we start our reference with, a reference to that collection. So which one are we using? Are we using a rooms collection, or are we using a users collection? That's what we need to figure out based off of the data that we're passing to this hook. So we can determine that by saying if the room ID, the parameter, the URL, includes the user ID, the current user's ID, because remember, we're composing the URL out of the end of the URL out of the current user's ID, and see if it's included within that. If that's the case, we can say this is a user room. We can say is user room, and we can determine what the document reference should be. So if it's a user room, we want to take that room ID and replace the user ID with just an empty string. Otherwise, we want to use the room ID as is. And that is what we're going to use for our document reference. So what is this going to look like for our query? Well, for our query, we're going to use the useDocument hook. So we'll import that from React Firebase hooks. And the reference that we use, so we'll use db once again, import it. Say db.collection, and if this is a user room, we'll include a ternary and use the users collection, otherwise the rooms collection. And the document reference is what we're storing in doc. So we'll just pass that to the doc method. So that allows us to get back our snapshot. And if we don't have a snapshot, let's just return null. Otherwise, if we do have one, let's return an object, since we're just returning one document. And we can set the ID to snapshot if we have it, .id. Well, we really don't need that here. We are already checking to see if we don't have a snapshot. So we will have a snapshot, and that means that the photo URL is going to be set to snapshot.photo URL, or again, our URL avatars.dicebear.com/api/human/snapshot_id.svg, and then finally we can spread in the rest of the snapshot data. So it's all that we need to do, and then back within chat, we can just console log the room information and see that this works. So let's take a look at our console. We can't see, we're not using the right import, so we need to go one level up into hooks, into use room. So once that's fixed, oops, I chained this is my mistake. Hopefully you caught that. I chained doc onto the wrong thing. I didn't include it at the end here. After collection, I put it in the wrong place. So once that's fixed, when we select a given room, we should be able to see in our console that we have actual data, the appropriate ID, the name that matches the link that we clicked, photo URL, and timestamp. And in the next video, we're going to take a look at how to create the basic structure of our chat component. The next step we'll take, since we're fetching the individual rooms with our use room hook, we're going to build out the structure of our chat component. So let's head back to chat. And we're going to begin with a div with the class name of chat. And we're going to have within it a div with some inline styles where we'll set the height to the page height. And the class name will be chat background. We'll have a chat header. So we'll have a div with the class name chat header. And we're going to display a back button to go back in our history if we're on a mobile device. We'll bring in an icon button, and we can import this from Material UI core. And our icon button is going to first of all have an on click, where if we click on it, we're going to go back in history. And we can work with history manually with the help of the use history hook, which is available from React Router DOM. So we can go ahead and import that. We can auto import it if possible and bring it up to where use params is. So we get a reference to history, and it has a convenient method on it called go back. So we can just pass a reference to our on click by saying history.goback. And within it, we'll include an icon, which is called arrow back. So after this, but still within the chat header, we're going to include a div with the class name avatar container. Let me spell avatar correctly. In that div, we will use the avatar component from Material UI. And this is going to have a source set to room if it's available, .photo URL. And that source should be on avatar. After the avatar container, but still within the chat header, we're going to have a div with the class name of chat header info. And this is going to include the name of the room. So we'll have an h3 with some inline styles. We'll set the width of this h3 according to whether we're on a mobile device. If so, we'll set it to page.width minus 165 pixels. And within it, we will use room.name. After this div, we'll have one with the class of chat header right. And this will consist of an input, which we will be able to use in order to add images, add image messages to our chat. It'll have the ID of image. We want to set its style to display none. We don't want to display the input itself. We want it to accept only image files, so we can say image slash and this asterisk to say basically any valid image file type. We want the type of the input to be file, and then underneath this input, we're going to have an icon button, which is going to include a label with the style of cursor set to pointer, a height of 24, and this is what's going to be visible instead of the input. And so this is going to be for the input with the ID of image. So we'll use HTML4 set to image to indicate that the label is controlling input. And we want to add, as a child of the label, a icon add photo alternate, and we'll make sure to bring that in. After this icon button, we're going to have another one, and this is going to be responsible to open a menu that will allow users to delete a given room, and the icon within it is going to be called more vert. So we'll import that from Material UI Icons. And then one more sibling of this icon button is going to be a menu component from not Material UI Icons. So be aware when you're using auto import, but from Material UI Core. We'll bring in menu, and it's going to have an ID of menu. It will also have a attribute or prop keep mounted, and within it we'll have a menu item with the text of delete room. So once we're done adding this menu, we should have two closing divs, and this is the entire chat header, so we can collapse this. And we'll move on to another div with the class name of chat body container. This will include a div with the class name of chat body and an inline style where we're setting the height according to page.height minus 68 pixels. Here we're going to have a new component which we'll bring in called chat messages. We'll go ahead and import that up at the top, chat messages from /chat messages. And we can bring in a couple more components. We'll also bring in chat footer and media preview. So that's it for right now for the chat body container. We'll include the media preview underneath that. Then the chat footer. And for now, that'll be it. So we'll save chat and take a look at its appearance. We can see all of our components here: media preview, chat footer, chat messages. To hide the media preview, if this overlay annoys you, we can just comment that out temporarily. And additionally, for our menu within our chat header, you might be seeing this error saying failed prop type. The prop open is marked as required. So we're not including that prop for our menu. So we could set open to false for now to remove that error. And in the next step, we'll see how to make this input accept an image and be able to show that image in our media preview so that we can afterwards post it as a message within one of our chat rooms. When it comes to selecting an image, we not only want to be able to take a given image file and store it, so we can then give it to another function so that we can upload it to Firebase storage, but additionally we want to show a preview when we select it. When we hit open, we want to use our media preview component to display it. So we not only need to store the image file itself in our component state, but we also want to store a preview of it that can be displayed within that media preview component. So we need to create two new pieces of state within our chat component. We'll go up to the top and we'll use React. So we'll make sure to import that. We'll say react.useState, and the first value, the initial value for the image will be null since we're holding on to an object. So we'll have the state variable called image, and the setter will be setImage. And additionally, we're going to have another piece of state that'll be initially an empty string, and this is just going to be for the source. And this is going to be for the image preview, and the setter for it will be setSource. So we want to create two different functions, one to show the preview and another to close the preview. So first of all, when someone selects a given image, the input using the onChange handler is going to call a function that's going to show our preview and set the image data in state as well as the source data. So we'll have this call a function show preview. Show preview is going to get the event, and we're going to get that image file from event.target.files, and we're going to get the 0th element. That is the file itself. We want to make sure that we have that file, so we'll set up a conditional and say if file. Then we want to set that image file in state, so we'll call setImage, pass file to it. And to be able to get this source value to generate a preview image, we're going to use the file reader API. So we'll say new file reader, and we're going to reference that in a variable called reader. And we want to use reader and say, and use the method read as data URL. So we want to create a data URL. This is what allows us to generate a preview of this image based off of an entire file object. And we can just say, when we call this method, we can use an event handler on load, which is connected to a function. And from this, specifically from reader.result, we're going to get our source. And we can pass that to setSource. So what are we going to do here? Well, for the image file, once it's put in state, we're not going to do anything with it just yet, but we are going to use the source, and specifically we're going to pass that to our media preview component, which we commented out. So we want to pass source down to it and head to media preview. We haven't filled out this component just yet, but it's going to be very simple. We're going to destructure source from props. If we do not have a value for it, we're going to return null and display nothing. Otherwise, we're going to return a div with the class name of media preview, and this is going to first consist of an icon. So we're going to have an icon called close rounded icon. We'll import this from Material UI icons. And this is going to have an onClick. We're not going to wrap it in an icon button component. And we're eventually going to have some function that's going to allow us to close the preview. Underneath that, we're going to display our image, or the source is going to be set to the source that we're getting from props. And we'll set the alt text to preview. So let's save everything and see if we can select an image. Make sure to have an image file. And this should actually be just close rounded, my mistake. And first we have to be in a chat. Then we can select an image file if you have a valid image. And we should be able to see that preview. Great. and this should work for desktop and mobile. And now we just want to make this functional so that we can click the icon and close it. So we want that close preview function that I mentioned, and we're going to create that underneath show preview. This is going to be very simple. All we're going to do is just set source back to its initial value and set image back to its initial value of an empty string and null respectively. And then if we head back down to media preview, we'll pass close preview as a prop to it, and then heading back to that component, destructure that from the props object, and then add an onClick to close rounded, so that when we save everything and click on that icon, we see the preview go away.